Welcome, fans. We're back live with another edition of the Cheap Heat Productions podcast. My name is Jack Kilby, no gimmicks guy on the socials. And I'm here today with a renowned author who has produced a book that is downright fascinating. We're going to get into all the facets of it, but it's an area of pro wrestling research and documentation that really is one that has been less focused on, to say the least, in the past. And Mr. Ian Douglas has certainly produced something very, very informative and unique here. The book is called A Decided Novelty, The Essential Guide to Black Pro Wrestling History, 1880 to 1950. Ian, welcome to the show.
Jack, thanks so much for having me. You said a renowned author. I'm excited to see who you have coming on after me.
Oh, you're being too self-deprecating there. We'll talk about some of your other pro wrestling related works in a minute too. But really, I guess the question is, given that I don't want to say this is an esoteric topic, but what was it that inspired you to write this, to take on this project?
So the main prompt was after the Pro Wrestling Authors Hall of Fame was put together, and that sounds far more impressive than it is. The qualifications to be placed in the Hall of Fame, it was having completed 4 books of a specific length, in a specific style, basically what most people think of when they think of an authored book, and of a certain size. And when I took a look at the list, there were 30 initial inductees, 27 were white, 2 Japanese, and then there was me. And so then I thought, okay, that's cool. I'm a Hall of Fame pro wrestling author, and I'm the only blackface here. So if I'm that guy, and I had people who followed that up by saying, "Hey, you're the best black pro wrestling author of all time." I said, well, that sounds pretty cool, but then are there certain responsibilities that come along with that title? And if I was on the outside looking in on that person, are there certain things that I would have wanted them to have wanted them to have written to be worthy of that title? And there are people who consider my 5th book, Bahamian Rhapsody, which is the history of pro wrestling in the Bahamas, which is my mom's home country and my wife's home country. But aside from that, I didn't really have anything that was a deep dive specifically into or addressing issues of Black pro wrestling history or identity. And so I decided to take on that challenge. So, I mean, I'll cut the answer right there, but what prompted me to engage with this sort of research and history, it was that.
Mm-hmm. Very, very, very understandable. The title, A Decided Novelty, it's very intriguing. When I came across it, that's the first thought that popped into my mind. Where did it come from, and what does it encapsulate or signify about the perception of Black wrestlers during the time frame in question?
Yeah, are you asking where the title specifically came from? Yeah, yes. I did an interview with Greg Oliver. I think that's being released in not too long from now, and he asked me the question. Well, it wasn't really a question. He just said you sort of get right into it. So I don't leave anyone really wondering for too long where the title came from. There was a syndicated editorial that was circulating through the northeastern U.S. in the early 1900s, and the writer of the editorial said, well, he was lamenting the fact that there were so few Black pro wrestlers, identifiable Black pro wrestlers of any identifiable, of any noticeable skill. And in fact, the tendency, the norm back then was to have Black pro wrestlers, especially in the South, they would go on first, and they weren't really wrestlers. They would get a handful of Black teenagers and throw the usually 4 or 5, and throw them into the ring to have a pre-show brawl, essentially, and the last man standing might walk out with a few dollars. And in many locations, that was the extent of Black athletic participation in a pro wrestling setting. And so the writer of the article concluded with the statement that a carnival, meaning a match between skilled colored wrestlers, would be a decided novelty, because the idea that you could actually have a pair of Black pro wrestlers competing against one another was such a far-fetched idea at the time that it would have been unfathomable that you could get to and put them in the same ring at the same time. So that's where the title of the book came from. And I tried to highlight, as the book progresses, I try to highlight the moments where audiences are finally getting to see, audiences in different regions of the country and in Canada primarily are getting to see 2 skilled Black pro wrestlers having an authentic match for the first time in front of them.
That's very, very interesting. How did you go about researching such an underrepresented part of wrestling history? And I know there's always challenges in research, but due to the nature of the topic, what challenges did you face uncovering these stories?
Well, in a lot of ways, it was easier than you might think, because at different times the press was sort of keeping score, and if somebody when a Black pro wrestler, right up to and through the 1950s, if they finally did something to stand out, the sports writers would ask them questions. Like, for instance, there was a great interview when Jack Claiborne was wrestling against Buddy Jackson, when they were doing a tour of the South in, I think it was 1954, or it might have been 52. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but they'd sort of paired off, and they were offering the Black match in a lot of Southern venues. And when they were asked who are the best Black pro wrestlers of the era, and they would tell you, well, the original Rufus Jones recently died, and the original Reginald Siki recently died, but you've also got Celie Samara, and you've also got Frank James, and you've also got Don Kindred, and you've also got Jim Mitchell. And so they would lay out their list almost as a top 10 of, here are the wrestlers that we consider to be or to have been the best Black pro wrestlers presently and in recent history. And so when I was getting started, they'd sort of laid out a trail of breadcrumbs for me to follow. I need to figure out who this guy is, when he got started, and what the claim to fame is. And, following along that path, the sports writers would sort of tell you, this is the first time a Black pro wrestler has appeared in this area since this person wrestled. Or they would tell you, well, Don Blackman wears leopard skin trunks, and he wrestles barefoot, and he has a goatee, and he'd tell you that he got a lot of that from Gorilla Parker. And, oh, Gorilla Parker, that sounds interesting. Or when you have King Kong Clayton and Celie Samara preparing to wrestle in St. Louis for the Negro World Wrestling Heavyweight Championship, and they're telling the press, well, in our eyes, the first person to hold that title was Tiger Jack Nelson. Okay, great. That means I need to do a lot of Tiger Jack Nelson research. And yeah, I'm getting long-winded here, but they sort of lay it out for you to follow the trail back and see who mattered to them. And as you keep following the trail back, and you'll end up with certain names. Like, for instance, I'll keep going if you'll let me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when you research the original Rufus Jones, you have people who were saying, well, he's the first. He was motivated to wrestle by the exploits of Illa Vincent, which may or may not have been true. It's highly unlikely, considering how old Rufus Jones' real name was Joseph Alvin Godfrey. He also wrestled as the original Tiger Flowers. He won the World Middleweight Championship in Boston in 1933 during his first year of activity. It's highly unlikely that he was aware of what Illa Vincent was doing in that area in 1917, or cared very much, considering he was probably 4 years old when that happened. But regardless, the writer laid it out there. And so you go to Illa Vincent, and he's European, probably from one of the probably from one of the German colonies in Africa. He shows up in the US speaking almost exclusively German, and he's blowing the minds of the press. They don't know what to do with him. It's likely the promoters didn't know what to do with him either, because they start rebranding him as Cuban. And when they rebrand him as Cuban, they're saying, well, he's the first Cuban wrestler to show up since Clarence Bolden. And I'm okay, Clarence Bolden. Was Clarence Bolden black? Let's take a look. And Clarence Bolden is called the Cuban Wonder. And they're saying, well, he's yellow-skinned, but he's Cuban. Well, Bolden doesn't strike me as being a very Cuban name, and it's not. And there were maybe three different places where it was hinted that Clarence Bolden might have had significant black ancestry. But there was one place. There were 2 places where they out and out said it. One was well after he retired. One is right before he wins the World Light Heavyweight Championship, and he won the World Light Heavyweight Championship after he'd already wrestled Frank Gotch, and Frank Gotch declared him to be essentially the best pound-for-pound pro wrestler in the world. So having that sort of endorsement from Frank Gotch, that made that assertion very interesting. And the newspaper out and out said I think it was like, they said something along the lines of, like, he's declared to be Cuban, but he's 100% Negro. Well, he's not 100% Negro or black, or nobody would have had to play any of these guessing games. But seeing that, I went to Ancestry.com and a few other genealogical websites, and I pulled the census records. I found out that he lived in Kansas City for a while. And in the 1900 census records, he's listed as black, married to a black woman, living with his black mother-in-law and his black brother-in-law in Kansas City. So that seemed like pretty solid evidence. Also, you pull the marriage certificate, and this is in Missouri at a time where it would have been illegal and no one would have performed the ceremony if they weren't both identified to be black. So, I mean, and also he lied about his age just in order to be able to get married, because the woman could be 17, the man had to be 21, or the marriage ceremony couldn't take place. And I think he was like 18 or 19 at the time, but he claimed to be 21. Yeah, I mean, anyway, that's neither here nor there. But Then I looked his name up in the Missouri newspapers, and there's an instance where Clarence and his brother are in trouble with the law and they both get arrested. It had to do with a robbery at a store. And it says that Clarence was mistakenly identified as white because he was so light-skinned that he was capable of passing. And it's like, okay, like that's our guy. This makes total sense. And at that point, I included that in the book, and I also informed my my superiors at the Ringer about this, and they wound up publishing it as a closing feature piece to Black History Month. And I'm using this as an example of how I just kept following the breadcrumbs backwards and came up with a pretty well-rounded, thoroughly fleshed out account of Black pro wrestling history, at least in North America from 1880 to 1950.
Wow, that's extremely interesting, and it makes total sense the way you laid it out. We have a Canadian wrestler by the name of Vance Nevada who a couple of years ago published a really seminal historical work on Canadian pro wrestling, and he mentioned that he got right into it and went and got into the microfiche and going through like hands-on deep research. Was that your experience as well? And did you find, he said that was the most valuable source that he had? Was that your experience as well?
100%. 100%. And you end up reading thousands. You may end up reading thousands of articles for each person. Now, if it's someone like Dr. Billy Collins, for instance, in the very early 1900s, who was primarily a bull wrestler, and a lot of people in Texas and Arkansas considered him to be a charlatan. But he goes from bull wrestling and then he makes his way to the upper Midwest and he does some legitimate professional wrestling. There's not a whole lot on him and he kind of disappears. So that's the sort of research that you could knock out in maybe 4 hours. But somebody like Tiger Flowers, original Rufus Jones, the same person, that takes a month. Jim Mitchell, the Black Panther, that takes a month. Seeley Samara, Jack Claiborne. You're spending a month on each of those people, and you kind of have to lay it out. Like when you research enough, you know who the big names are. You know who the pillars are, to the extent where if you don't include them in this, then it's a problem, because they were major figures of the era, and that's undeniable. And so I figured out who those people were, and just figured each one of them, they have to get at least 10,000 words, maybe up to 20,000 words worth of material devoted to them in this book, because they were that important. And others, the extent of what you can find on them might only be 2,000 words or up to 5,000 words. But whatever I could find that was of value, I made sure it got included. And I think that's reflected in the length of the book. I mean, with photos, it's 588 pages, so nearly 600.
Mm-hmm. A Canadian fan on social media, not that this is directly, well, in a way, in terms of legacy, it's related, wanted to get your thoughts on where Sweet Daddy Siki falls in terms of being important for Black pro wrestlers in the business, being a trailblazer, so to speak.
Is this, did Greg Oliver send you that?
No.
It's tough. That's a tough one, because that one in particular is tough, because having done the research, it's hard to have looked at everything I've looked at and not think of him as I'm not going to call him a knockoff. I'm going to say that in a sense he was a tribute act to two different wrestlers, because originally Sweet Daddy Siki wrestles as Reginald Siki with no reference given to Reginald Berry, who was the original Reginald Siki, who dies of a heart attack at the end of 1948. And then you take a look at the footage of Sweet Daddy Siki's matches in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and he's a kid then, and you, judging from the 1 minute of footage that I've been able to find of Jack Claiborne in action in Australia from like 1950, 51, where he's completely broken down. He's been wrestling for 20 straight years, throwing 5 to 15 drop kicks a night, landing on a stiff wrestling ring mat. I can't find any difference between what Sweet Daddy Siki was doing in the late 50s through early 60s and what Jack Claiborne was probably doing by 1935. And Claiborne was out of the business the year before Sweet Daddy Siki debuted, and Claiborne committed suicide because he was so broken down and couldn't get booked anymore. Claiborne commits suicide in 1960. So it's a great question. There's no doubt that Sweet Daddy Siki didn't have it hard wrestling where he wrestled in certain eras, but where do I rank him as a trailblazer? Between 1930 and 1950, the book covers 15 guys in that era, at least, that probably had it a lot harder. And again, it's hard for me to consider him anything other than a tribute act to Claiborne and the original Reginald Siki, except that Claiborne was more physically impressive. I think at least in his prime, I think Sweet Daddy Siki was like 5'7", 5'8", and Jack Claiborne was 6'1", 6'2".
Wow, fascinating stuff. This is probably going to be a difficult question to narrow down, but what was if you could, maybe a couple, if you could describe the most surprising facets of the topic that you uncovered in terms of the contributions of these early pioneers to Black pro wrestling, what would that or those be?
Oh man. Most surprising things that I uncovered. The first one would probably be that the original Tiger Flowers and the original Rufus Jones were the same guy, which means that Joe Alvin Godfrey was wrestling for 5 years under some version of the name Tiger Flowers, primarily in the Northeast. And then he shows up in Detroit as Rufus Jones, and he's suddenly the main event heel, and he's probably the foremost main event heel in the Midwest and in Ontario for 13 years. And he reverts back to using the name Tiger Flowers when he comes back to the Northeast. And historians weren't putting that together for the longest time. It's like, hey, Tiger Flowers popped up for a second and he disappeared. And it was also probably made confusing because by the fact that Tiger Flowers was almost like a public domain name for Black wrestlers and Black boxers, because you had the famous middleweight fighter Tiger Flowers, who died in 1927. And as a tribute to him, dozens of Black boxers took on the name Tiger Flowers, as did Joe Godfrey in the wrestling ring. And Joe Godfrey leaves to play Rufus Jones, and suddenly the people who are running opposition to Charlie Gordon in Boston bring out a Tiger Flowers of their own. And then when Jack Pfeffer, who had a hand in helping to launch Joe Godfrey as Tiger Flowers in the New York region, he heads out to Oregon and he brings a knockoff Tiger Flowers with him that lasts like 3 weeks. But so I see where it was difficult to trace, but the Rufus Jones and Tiger Flowers promo photos are absolutely identical. The wrestling style is absolutely identical. And then a newspaper in Ontario actually said, well, you may be wondering where Rufus Jones is. Well, he's off wrestling in New England as Tiger Flowers, but he'll be back. Yeah, that was a tough one. That was a tough one to put together. But the idea, the reason that's so intriguing is because there was a sculptress in the Northeast, Emily Winthrop Miles, who sculpted a bust of the original Tiger Flowers that's sitting in the Harvard Art Museums right now, and they couldn't figure out who that was since the 1930s. I've since informed them. We'll see what they do with that information, but they had no idea that was Joe Alvin Godfrey, and unless you thoroughly researched Rufus Jones, the original, you never would have known that. And then something else surprising that I learned is the way the use of headbutts amongst Black wrestlers sort of spread like a virus, and how the original Rufus Jones was the catalyst for that. Now, there are cases of Black wrestlers occasionally using headbutts, like a lot of different wrestlers were using. Jim Mitchell, for instance, there's a case of him closing a match early in his career with headbutts after another a white wrestler headbutted him and things got rough. But Rufus Jones is the first to make it a signature piece of his act, night in and night out, where he's stringing together 3, 5, 10 headbutts at a time and bloodying his opponent and then pinning him. And he starts doing that. He's using jumping headbutts in 1938, but he really gets down to that business in like 1939. And then I'm trying to think of the order. Jack Claiborne does it a few times when he's trying to be a heel, 1945, but he didn't really transition over to using it yet. Jim Mitchell in 1946, he goes to New England and he's wrestling in Massachusetts and Maine. And he's wrestling as his normal Black Panther self in Massachusetts. But in Maine, he's wrestling under a mask, and he's wrestling as the Black Panther, but they call him East Indian. And as an East Indian hooded wrestler, he starts throwing headbutts the same way Rufus Jones would. And he and Rufus were tag team partners for a long, long time in the Midwest. But he starts throwing headbutts the same way, as if it's, as a classic heel, he's hiding something under his mask and it's making his head hard. And, but then later on, he takes the mask off, reveals that he's a Black wrestler, but he keeps using the headbutts. And then he goes out to Los Angeles in 1947 and continues using the headbutts. So by 1947, you have Rufus Jones using it, and his former tag team partner, Jim Mitchell, is also using the headbutt. And then Jack Claiborne, who is the high-flying, drop-kicking wrestler who, in the early stages of his career is also super strong with the lean, perfect body. So he's a bit of a natural athlete, high wire act. He wins the Hawaiian championship, which he holds for about a year, which was the longest title reign of an identifiably Black wrestler in a major territory at the time by far. I think the longest up until that point was Sealy Samara, 5-6 months with the Pacific Northwest title. Claiborne goes almost a year. And as soon as he gets the belt, he starts mixing jumping headbutts in with the flying drop kicks and the other athletic stuff. And, all of a sudden, like, it is Rocky Johnson's style in the 1970s and 80s. It is what Tony Atlas was aspiring to do in the 70s and 80s. They probably don't realize it's what they were aspiring to do. I'm sure somebody advised them, this is how you should wrestle. This is how a wrestler of your type should wrestle. But Jack Claiborne is the first one to mix all that together. And that's in roughly September, October of 1948. During that title reign, he's simultaneously carrying around his World Negro Heavyweight Championship. And so while he's the junior heavyweight champion in Hawaii, which was the only championship in Hawaii at the time, he also defends the World Negro title in Honolulu against Sealy Samara, defeats him. Sealy Samara heads back to the Northeast. And when Samara shows up there, suddenly he's a headbutting machine as well. So in that era, from, call it 1930 to 1955, the four main wrestlers, the four main black wrestlers who were sort of carrying the torch that the original Reginald Siki handed off were Jack Claiborne, Jim Mitchell, Sealy Samara, and Rufus Jones. And by the middle of 1949, all four headbutting people all over North America. And so then later on, Frank James picks it up, Don Kindred picks it up, and Bearcat Wright picks it up in the early 1950s. Bobo Brazil, of course, picks it up in the early 1950s. And suddenly the headbutt is an essential part of the black pro wrestling experience.
Wow, that's extremely interesting stuff. You mentioned how there were significant legal and social constraints that these wrestlers were subject to. Can you elaborate on those and how these pioneering individuals overcame those barriers?
Legal and social constraints. I mean, certainly there were areas of the country where they could not wrestle. The first time I can find, well, let me try to do this in order. So a guy who doesn't get a lot of credit as a black pro wrestling pioneer or as a wrestling pioneer, period, is Phoebe Smith Williams, who boxed under the name George Godfrey. And he was one of the guys who the title, the Black Panther, I get into all of this in the book, but there was this idea sort of starting with Jack Johnson, the famous boxer, that for several generations of heavyweight title holders, there was always a Black Panther or a predominant black wrestler who was sort of stalking the top white boxers. And that title got transferred from Jack Johnson to Harry Wills, who carried the name of the Black Panther in the ring. And now that title had fallen to George Godfrey. And by the way, you also find instances where Joe Louis is also being referred to as the Black Panther when he first begins to threaten for the world title. But George Godfrey is carrying the title of Black Panther, and he becomes famous for sort of throwing fights that he's clearly winning. One of the most famous cases is with Primo Carnero, where he starts throwing repeated low. I think this is the one where he starts throwing repeated low blows for no reason, and he ends up getting banned by a lot of the top boxing commissions. And in the process, so immediately he starts boxing in Mexico and he starts boxing in Europe, but he also says, well, I'm going to become a pro wrestler now. And a lot of the boxing commissions that had local jurisdiction, they immediately start banning black versus white wrestling matches. And it's really an anti-George Godfrey bill. The strongest of those was in Texas, where they passed a law that banned both black versus white boxing and black versus white wrestling. And the end result of that is a case where Jack Claiborne, who had been wrestling in Oregon and California, Jack Claiborne is brought into Texas and he wrestles in Mexico with no problem. In fact, they declare he's Ethiopian, and you have a lot of anti-Italian Mexicans. This is in the sort of pre-World War II era where you have the invasion of Ethiopia by Italy. So they pick him up on his shoulders after he wins, and they're shouting, Viva Ethiopia, down with Mussolini, those sorts of things. But he can't wrestle on the other side of the El Paso River because of the ban. And the promoter in Texas, in El Paso, attempts to pass him off as Cuban, as if the national identity trumps the racial identity in that case, and it did not. So he had to wrestle in Mexico. He was fine wrestling in New Mexico, but he wasn't allowed to wrestle in Texas. And excuse me. And so in the southern states, the real color line of pro wrestling gets broken when Don Kindred and Don Blackman sort of cross over from Pennsylvania into Virginia, and they start wrestling as the true main event on I can't really call them mid-Atlantic cards yet, but in Richmond and some other areas of Virginia. And that's when they start allowing black wrestling fans to sit in the upper deck so that they can start profiting on their interests as well. And eventually, Don Blackman is invited back to the Mid-Atlantic by the original Jim Crockett, and they start wrestling, and Don Blackman and Buddy Jackson start wrestling in the Carolinas. And then Don Blackman puts together his all-Negro wrestling tour of the South, and that's when they start hitting the deep South states. He has Buddy Jackson with him. He brings Frank James with him. He brings the Black Panther of usually it's called the Black Panther of Wisconsin, but he brings Alex Kaffner with him, who's a very experienced black pro wrestler. And that ends up being the first serious tour of all black pro wrestling talent in the Deep South. And that's also in the late 1940s.
Yeah, that's something that historians comment on, and I'm sure you probably got into that in granular detail, and that's that wrestling was one of the few, early group events where that color barrier seemed to mean less than in some other areas of society, because of the fact that pro wrestling has always been about making money. Do you think wrestling deserves, based on your research into the very seminal period where that happened that you just touched on, do you think it deserves that credit, if you will, for being more colorblind than some other sporting and, say, theatrical events were at the time?
That's difficult to say, because and one of the good things about capitalism, this isn't anti-capitalism by any means. I love capitalism. Capitalism tends to be very self-interested. It's very self-interested. You may like one group more than another. You may like your group more than another, but you tend to like yourself above all others. And if you can figure out a way to profit to profit on something, then you really have to decide if you want your prejudice to trump your pockets, or how you could potentially line them. And so, I don't know how much credit I want to give pro wrestling as a whole for color blindness, because again, as this is occurring, as these lines are being crossed, you also have savvy sports writers who are writing editorials, and they're asking the question, now wait a minute, we've had black pro boxing champions since the early 1900s in pretty much all weight classes. Why is it that in none of these pro wrestling circuits, it doesn't seem that any of these guys are able to break through and become dominant? Like, what is it about pro wrestling that prevents that from happening? And yeah, that's because you can control the outcomes of pro wrestling matches to a far greater extent than you could control the outcomes of pro boxing matches, which isn't to say that fixes didn't happen in pro boxing. They occurred all the time, but there was probably some concern about what would happen to how willing the regular wrestling fans would be to support a product if they felt any sort of prejudice and they had to return week after week to see a black wrestler defeating all of the white wrestlers and anyone else who dared to cross it. And so again, does it deserve some credit? Yeah, I certainly think guys like Charlie Gordon deserve credit in Boston, where in his rookie year he gives the Black Panther Ed Flowers, who was Joe Alvin Godfrey, he gives him the World Middleweight Championship, which was his top title. He gives it to him during his rookie year. And the first time Sealy Samara shows up in Boston, because he'd been wrestling as the Black Panther the Black Demon George Hodgson in Western Massachusetts, and he'd wrestled as Zelis Amhara in Canada. And so, making that name a little bit more alliterative, he shows up in Boston as Sealy Samara, and Charlie Gordon hands him the World Heavyweight Championship, which had not been a title that had previously been defended. He just shows up and he's Gordon's World Heavyweight Champion and begins defending it. And then Gordon, probably because he was losing the promotional war, is forced to have Samara drop that distinction. And if he wants to start collaborating with Paul Bowser, and Lou Thez is brought in, and the press starts talking about belt consolidation. And then Sealy Samara wrestles against Steve Crusher Casey. Samara has not lost any matches yet, but he's no longer referred to as a world heavyweight champion. Casey's the world champion, and he gets crushed by Casey in straight falls, and then he's never referred to as a world heavyweight champion again. So when we start talking about first black world champion, first black world heavyweight champion with a race neutral title, Vero Small gets referred to as a world champion as far back as the late 1800s, but that was like a one-off saying, come see world champion Vero Small. There's no evidence that he ever defended the title, beat anybody for it, and it's hard to give that claim any real credibility. The way we tend to think about the way we tend to ascribe credibility to those sorts of things. Clarence Bolden, certainly world middleweight champion, world light heavyweight champion, but I was having the discussion with Dave Meltzer, like if the guy was going out of his way not to appear to be black, then was he really the first black world champion? And I don't know the answer to that. If he's open about his identity, maybe he doesn't get these opportunities And that's probably still an era where the majority of the outcomes were legitimate.
Mm.
So, there are people who would back Bolden as the first Black world champion, the way we think about it. Frank Crozier in Great Britain, the Jamaican Scot, he wins the World Open Alhambra tournament in the middleweight division in London. And so for a year, he's referred to as the world middleweight champion over there until he loses in the semifinals of the following year's tournament. That's 1908. Then in North America, the first identifiable Black world middleweight champion I can find is Joe Godfrey when he's wrestling as Ed Flowers in Boston before he starts wrestling as Tiger Flowers Johnstone in New York. But then if you want to tack the heavyweight label onto it, I think you kind of have to settle on Sealy Samara in late 1937 in Boston. The problem with that is he doesn't beat anybody for it. And as soon as the merge happens, it's like they forgot that he ever held it in the first place. And then, in all fairness, you also have to get into whether or not a world title was really a world title just because somebody said it was. Like if it was isolated to one city, was it really a world championship just because the promoter wanted to promote a world champion? But then a couple years later, you have him as Zeli Samara winning the world junior heavyweight title in Montreal, which was their top title. You have him winning the junior heavyweight championship in the Pacific Northwest in the mid 40s that he holds for 5 or 6 months over the course of 2 reigns. And then you have Jim Mitchell in there somewhere with like a 3-month reign as the Sandusky light heavyweight champion or something like that, which is weird because I think Sandusky at the time had maybe 30,000 residents. But I mean, proud of that promoter for making a Black guy the champion of something back then. And then Jack Claiborne is with nearly a year-long reign as the title holder of what would become one of the major territories of the NWA for Al Karasik as promoter, who was a power broker in the original NWA. So what do you consider to be the first major Black title reign of distinction? I mean, it's all in the eye of the beholder. I like to give some sort of credit to all of them.
Yeah, when you're talking about heavyweight world titles, I got to think back to Ron Simmons in WCW in '92. That was an integral part of the promotion of his push to the top and his defenses. It was, here's the first Black world champion, but before him, not the WCCW was on the same level. Iceman Parsons also held it. So yeah. Would you consider in the modern era that Ron Simmons would hold that distinction?
I think he's clearly, when you start talking about a promotion being truly national, where everybody gets to see it, I would probably say that Ron Simmons holds that distinction. You're going to have people who say it was Bearcat Wright in Los Angeles with the world heavyweight title there. I think that was in the WWA, but again, that's Los Angeles is the entire territory pretty much. So, again, people can make up their own minds as to what truly deserves to be considered that reign. And a lot of it, I think, is, I don't necessarily know that it's willful amnesia, but in a lot of these cases, a lot of facts about Black pro wrestlers hadn't been unearthed or discovered, or especially in the case of Clarence Bolden, put in their proper context. And I think I think there's a tendency to overrate the importance of the term heavyweight, because now everything is a heavyweight championship, even though, I mean, really, they're all open weight championships because in most cases, they're the only championships that are presented. But in the case of, I mean, for instance, Charlie Gordon's promotion, his top belt was the middleweight title. In Hawaii, Al Karasic's top championship was the Ring Magazine belt, which was probably the most iconic looking belt of the time. That was the Hawaii, and that belt represented the Hawaii Junior Heavyweight Championship. And Al Karasic, I think I included the quote from him in the book. If it's not in that book, it's in the Rough Rufus Gentleman Jack book, where he's explaining during one of his press conferences that he thinks heavyweight wrestling and women's wrestling are fads that aren't going to go anywhere. And that people wanted to see essentially the real athletes, the real male athletes of pro wrestling, and that could only be found in the junior heavyweight division. And this is also taking into account that pro wrestling was honed so closely with pro boxing that for a long time they tried to keep it. They tried to have some sort of legitimacy to the weight divisions, and in the Depression era, it was hard to feed a lot of people enough to get them up to the light heavyweight and heavyweight level. So almost everybody was a middleweight that you could find to get into the ring. It was hard to find a person who was that heavy. And so the promoters tried to offer a championship that would be credible in terms of, it passes the optics test of how heavy these guys are, because all of the people watching wrestling are watching boxing and they know what a heavyweight looks like. And at the same time, they want that championship to offer the greatest number of opportunities for the majority of the wrestlers who are participating to compete for the championship. And so the modern tendency would be to look at, oh, he was the light heavyweight champion, he was the middleweight champion, those are lesser titles. No, they weren't then. Those were the titles. That was it. And I also, sorry, I'll wrap up the point. I know I'm spouting off here, but
no, please.
Especially in the case of some of these black wrestlers, historically, I think it really hurts them with respect to Hall of Fame candidacy, because when we don't have footage of the people, when we don't have footage of the wrestlers, and we really don't have the context for how big of a draw they were, what do we tend to look at? Well, we'll look at how many championships they held or what championships they held, and we'll try to use that to figure out how important they were. Well, when promoters loved, there were certain promoters who loved putting black wrestlers in main events. Claiborne was a main eventer everywhere he wrestled. Almost everywhere. There were some promoters in California who didn't seem to like him very much, but in the majority of cases, Claiborne was a main eventer everywhere he wrestled. Rufus Jones was a main eventer everywhere he wrestled. And if you simply looked at the number of championships they held, you wouldn't note it. Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't know it. And if you're determining Hall of Fame candidacy solely on the basis of championships or title count, you look at Claiborne and say, oh, well, people credit him as a British Empire champion. I can't find one result suggesting that he ever held that title. So he's a one-time Hawaiian light heavyweight title holder. He held the belt for almost a year. That was unheard of for a black wrestler. But without that context, you just say, okay, so he held a light heavyweight title, big deal. He was nothing. He was a massive star everywhere he wrestled. And the galling thing was, he comes back from Hawaii and Australia, and the promoters in California, it's almost like they tried to sweep under the rug that he was ever the champion in Hawaii. Like they didn't want people to think that a black wrestler could possibly hold that title. So they're using the great promotional photo of him with the Ring Magazine belt, but they're telling the fans that that's the Negro World Heavyweight title belt, not the Hawaiian Championship belt. And then they start referring to him as the Black Antonino Rocca because of the similarity of their wrestling style. Claiborne had been wrestling, I think, 15 years before Rocca started wrestling. And thankfully, some sports writers caught on after a few of them had been referring to Claiborne as the Black Antonino Rocca. And I use the comparison that would be like somebody referring to Joe Louis years after he boxed and retired, that he was the Black Rocky Marciano. And fortunately, there were some sports writers in that era who said, like, no, he was at this with the same style long before Antonino Rocca. And if anything, Antonino Rocca is the white Jack Claiborne. I found that very refreshing to see that there were some people in that era who were willing to acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm. How did the wrestlers, the pioneers that you've written about, how do they continue to influence modern professional wrestling? And we're talking, the 70s, 80s, 90s into today. Do you see their imprint, so to speak, in the guys on the big company rosters today or otherwise?
I think the influence starts to fade as you get into the 90s. But then again, my good friend Oliver Bateman would point out that it almost seems like the headbutting proclivity that used to follow around black wrestlers, that seemed to get picked up by the Samoan wrestlers in the 1970s, and that certainly lingers and echoes into the present day. So maybe there's an argument to be made that there are shades of the original Rufus Jones and Jack Claiborne, especially when you start talking about the hyper athletic Samoan wrestlers also continuing to use headbutts. I think that's certainly shades of Jack Claiborne. But again, I think the more influential somebody is, like, we can use the Soul Patrol, like Rocky Johnson, Tony Atlas, the Junkyard Dog. So you had plenty of white wrestlers and wrestlers of other races who were fans of them, and they start to pick up some of those traits and borrow from them and make it part of their own act, make it part of their own routine. And so those are tendencies that start to become less black identified, and I think that's a good thing. And so it no longer becomes a stereotype that the black wrestler in the ring, oh, well, he's going to be naturally more thick-skulled than his white counterparts. And that's a stereotype that you probably want to fade away along the way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You've, in addition to A Decided Novelty, you've done a few wrestling-related books, which you mentioned, but also the autobiographies of some wrestlers. You were the co-author on Steve Kern, Bugsy McGraw, Dan Severn. How does this particular work differ from those processes? And if you're looking down the road at future projects, are you going to do more pro wrestling works, or where are you looking at for your next project or project?
Sure. Yeah. Also, Hornswoggle and Brian Blair. Shout out to those guys. As far as future projects, I'll tell you because it's done. I hate to tell people about works in progress because, first of all, you don't want anyone to say, "Oh, that's a great idea," and then they jump on it. and do it before you. You also don't want to jump on them and do it and do a worse job. Like, okay, I got to rush this out. But I'll tell you, because it's done, Mike Rotunda's autobiography is finished.
Oh, wow.
And we're just waiting for the right opportunity to release that, but we could release that tomorrow if he was so inclined. There is one other area. So the Bahamas Pro Wrestling book is the one, when I got started in this, that's the one I told myself, it would be really cool. Like, that's the impossible bookie, and you'll never be able to write that one. So let's try it. And once I finished it, I said, great. Like, as far as I was concerned, the pressure's off. There's nothing else I feel like I need to write. So now I can just sort of have fun with it. And then the Pro Wrestling Authors Hall of Fame thing happened, and I saw, oh, okay, I'm the Black pro wrestling author right now. So now the pressure's back on. And what maybe some people realize, or maybe they don't, I know Gentleman Jack and Rough Rufus got released first, but this is a case where I had to sort of write the books in parallel, because they were written simultaneously. And the idea is, in order to put Jack Claiborne and Rufus Jones in the proper context, I needed to know every nugget of information that I could find about all of the Black pro wrestling pioneers, so that I wasn't making outrageous claims about what they were the first to do, and that I could also give proper, I could also offer brief explanations of what their peers had accomplished that were accurate. And that's part of what I intended A Decided Novelty to be, is now that this book is written, I'll give you an example. In a lot of cases, the book was released or first promoted, and the first thing a lot of people did is, like, they post a photo of Bobo Brazil underneath the book. And, like, that's great. Bobo doesn't show up in this until 1949. He's a rookie in Benton Harbor, Michigan. He barely has anything to do with that period of time. Or they post a photo of Bearcat right underneath it. Bearcat was born in 1932. His dad showed up in Celie Samara's, because his dad was a boxer who shows up in Celie Samara's corner when Samara's wrestling in Nebraska. But Bearcat Wright Jr. didn't have anything to do with pro wrestling until the 1950s. And that's, I wanted to put things I wanted to put this history in its proper perspective, so that if someone wants to come along and write a fantastic Bobo Brazil biography, or they want to do a Bearcat Wright biography, or they want to do a Sweet Daddy Siki biography, or Luther Lindsay, I think all of those have their merits, but they will have the full backstory of Black pro wrestling, so they will understand on whose shoulders these guys stood, so that they're not making outrageous assertions about what they were the first to accomplish as they wrestled later into the 50s and into the 60s and beyond. So in saying all of that, I needed to write that so that I didn't commit the same mistakes when I wrote the Rufus Jones and Jack Claiborne book. And going forward, I do have another book in progress. No, I will not tell anyone what it's about. It is not an autobiography. When you see it, a lot of people are going to say, that makes no sense. The people who really know me are going to say that makes perfect sense. The Bahamian book was the book I felt I would be fun to write, and that I needed to write in order to say that I'd done what I really wanted to do. The Black Pro Wrestling book is the book where I said, okay, if you are what other people say you are, you'll write this book. And the one that's forthcoming that isn't Mike Rotunda's book, that's the one where I said, okay, if you are who you think you are, you'll write this book. And so that's going to be the final one.
Well, I'll tell you, this is certainly extremely interesting stuff. I would encourage all the fans that have an appreciation for history to check out all of Mr. Douglas's work, but especially this one, to get that. Again, it's an area that hasn't up until now been covered with the finite detail that it deserves. Ian, where can the fans find you, and most importantly, where can they pick up the book?
Yeah, if you want to add to my pathetic count of followers on Twitter, you can find me at Streamglass, STREAMGLASS. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to call it Twitter anymore, on X, formerly known as Twitter. And if you want to find any of the books, they are all available on Amazon. So go there right now and check them out.
Absolutely. Well, Ian, once again, thank you very much for your time. I definitely want to pick up the Rotundo book when it drops, and I'd like to have you back to discuss that one too.
Anytime you like, man. It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Well, fans, that's it for this edition of the Cheap Heat Productions podcast with Ian Douglas. Make sure you check out his book, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for watching this video. Please give it a like if you enjoyed it. Be sure to follow us on all social media platforms at Cheap Heat Productions. Don't forget to hit the notification button, and you won't miss any